Margaret, a 68-year-old widow from suburban Chicago, expects a quiet 69th birthday celebration with her daughter Sarah. Instead, Sarah arrives with a lawyer and devastating news that will shatter everything Margaret thought she knew about her late husband's legacy and her own financial security. What begins as a family betrayal unfolds into a journey of resilience, legal battles, and unexpected alliances that will test the bonds between mother and daughter. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 p.m., just like Sarah promised it would. I had spent the morning preparing her favorite lemon cake, the same recipe I'd been making for her birthday celebrations since she was 7 years old. Funny how traditions flip when your child becomes the adult and you become the one waiting for validation that you still matter. I smoothed my floral dress, the one Sarah bought me last Christmas, and checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. 69 years old today, and I still felt like that nervous young mother, wondering if I was doing everything right. "Happy birthday, Mum," Sarah said when I opened the door, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. She was wearing her power suit, the navy blue one she reserved for important court appearances. Behind her stood a man I'd never seen before, clutching a leather briefcase like it contained nuclear codes. "Sarah, honey, you didn't need to bring anyone," I started, but she cut me off. "Mum, this is David Richardson, my colleague from the firm. We need to talk." The word colleague hit me strangely. Not friend coming to celebrate, not someone who wanted to meet you. Colleague. My stomach tightened, but I forced my hostess smile. "Of course, come in, both of you. I made your favorite cake." David Richardson looked like every lawyer I'd ever seen on television. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, and that particular brand of professional sympathy that made me instantly uncomfortable. He was probably Sarah's age, mid-40s with graying temples that suggested he'd seen his share of difficult conversations. "Mrs. Chen," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for having me. I'm sorry we have to meet under these circumstances." Under these circumstances? It was my birthday. What circumstances? Sarah avoided my eyes as we walked into the living room. The same living room where Harold and I had hosted countless dinner parties, where Sarah had opened Christmas presents, where we'd celebrated every milestone of our lives together. Now it felt foreign, like a stage set for a play I hadn't auditioned for. "Would you like some coffee, tea?" I asked, clinging to the familiar rituals of hospitality. "Mom, please sit down," Sarah said, her voice carrying that tone she used when she was about to deliver bad news, the same tone she'd used when she told me she was getting divorced, when she announced she was moving to New York for her career, when she informed me Dad's cancer had spread. I sat in Harold's old recliner, my recliner now, I supposed, though I still thought of it as his. The leather was worn where his head used to rest, a depression that would never fill back in. David opened his briefcase with the precision of a surgeon. Sarah perched on the edge of the couch like she might need to run. "Mrs. Chen," David began, "I'm going to be direct because I believe you deserve to know the truth immediately." The truth about what? My hands started trembling, that involuntary shake that had been getting worse since Harold died 2 years ago. The doctor said it was normal aging. I suspected it was grief manifesting in my nervous system. "Your late husband, Harold, made some financial decisions in his final years that, well, they're going to impact your current situation significantly." I looked at Sarah, searching for an explanation in her face, but she was studying her hands like they contained ancient secrets. "I don't understand. Harold managed everything. He always said I didn't need to worry about money, that he'd taken care of everything." David pulled out a thick folder. "Mrs. Chen, are you aware that Harold took out 3 separate loans against this house in the 2 years before his death?" The words hit me like physical blows. "Loans? What loans? This house has been paid off since 1998. "I'm afraid not. The current balance owed is $347,000. The number floated in the air between us, impossible and devastating. I felt like I was falling through the floor of my own living room. That's impossible. Harold would never—" "Mom," Sarah finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's more. More. How could there be more?" David continued with the relentless efficiency of someone who delivered this kind of news before. "Your husband also borrowed against his pension fund, withdrew the majority of your joint savings, and—" He paused, which somehow made it worse. "He invested everything in a cryptocurrency scheme that has since been revealed as fraudulent." The room spun. Not metaphorically, literally spun like I was on some terrible carnival ride I couldn't get off. "How much?" I managed to ask, including the house loans, pension withdrawals, and savings. "Approximately $680,000. $680,000. Our entire life savings, the security Harold had promised me, the nest egg that was supposed to see me through retirement, through whatever health issues might come, through the long, lonely years of being a widow, gone. "I think I'm going to be sick," I said, and I wasn't sure if I meant it metaphorically. Sarah finally looked at me, and I saw my own devastation reflected in her eyes. But there was something else there, something that looked suspiciously like anger. "Mom, did you know? Did you sign anything? Any documents, any papers?" The accusation in her voice cut deeper than David's financial revelations. My own daughter was asking if I was complicit in the destruction of our family's financial security. "No, Sarah, how can you even ask me that? I trusted your father completely. He handled everything, the bills, the investments, the insurance. He said it was too complicated for me to worry about." It was true, Harold had insisted on managing all our finances from the day we married. It was 1978, and that's how marriages worked then. The man handled money, the woman handled home. I'd been grateful not to deal with the stress of investments and tax returns and all those boring adult responsibilities. Now I realized my gratitude had been naive, dangerously naive. "The bank has already initiated foreclosure proceedings," David said. "You have 60 days before they can legally force a sale." 60 days? I'd lived in this house for 31 years. Sarah had grown up here. Harold had died in the bedroom upstairs. And now, in 60 days, it would belong to strangers. What am I supposed to do? The question came out as a whisper, because my voice couldn't carry the weight of my panic. "We're going to fight this," Sarah said suddenly, with more conviction than she'd shown since walking through my door. "David specializes in elder financial abuse cases. We think Harold might have been influenced." Influenced. The word hung in the air like smoke. "You think someone convinced him to steal our money?" "We don't know yet. But the pattern is unusual for someone with Harold's financial background. These weren't gradual poor decisions. These were sudden, dramatic changes in his financial behavior, all happening in the final 2 years of his life when his mind was starting to go," I finished for her. Harold's dementia diagnosis had been devastating enough the first time. Now I was being asked to relive it through the lens of financial catastrophe. The early signs had been subtle: forgetting names, losing track of conversations, that increasing confusion about dates and times. We'd attributed it to normal aging, then to stress from his retirement, then finally to the disease that would eventually take him from me piece by piece. But what if, during those early stages, when he still seemed capable of making decisions, someone had taken advantage of his declining judgment? Who? I asked. Who would do this to him? David and Sarah exchanged a look that told me they already had theories they weren't ready to share. "That's what we're going to find out," David said. "But first, we need to stop the foreclosure and buy time for investigation." As I sat there in Harold's chair in the living room where we'd planned our retirement dreams, I felt the last illusions of my old life crumbling around me. The man I'd trusted with everything, the partnership I'd believed was unshakable, the future I'd assumed was secure, none of it had been real. But looking at my daughter, seeing the determination replacing the anger in her eyes, I realized something else. I wasn't facing this alone. "What do we do first?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "We fight back," Sarah said simply. And for the first time since the doorbell rang, I believed we might actually have a chance. If this story is hitting close to home for you, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Sometimes the most unexpected betrayals come from the people we trust most, and I have a feeling this journey is just beginning. The next morning, I woke up in Harold's recliner with a crick in my neck, and the devastating weight of yesterday's revelations pressing down on my chest like a concrete blanket. For a blessed moment, I thought it might have been a nightmare. Then I saw David's business card on the coffee table, and reality crashed back down. Sarah had spent the night in her old room upstairs, the first time she'd slept in this house since Harold's funeral. I could hear her moving around, probably getting ready for what she kept calling damage control mode. My daughter had always been a fighter, even as a little girl. When the neighborhood bullies picked on her friend Jessica, Sarah had marched right up to them and threatened to tell their mothers. She was 8 years old and fearless. I needed some of that fearlessness now. The smell of coffee drifted down from the kitchen, and I realized Sarah must have figured out Harold's complicated espresso machine, the one I'd never bothered to learn how to use. Another small reminder of how much I'd let him handle, how much I'd chosen not to learn. "Morning, Mom," Sarah called when she heard my footsteps on the kitchen tiles. She was already dressed in another power suit, this one charcoal gray, her hair pulled back in what she called her warrior bun. Her laptop was open on the kitchen table, surrounded by printed documents and yellow legal pads covered in her precise handwriting. "You've been busy," I said, accepting the cup of coffee she handed me. It was perfect, exactly the right amount of cream, no sugar, the way I'd been drinking it for 40 years. "I called in some favors last night. David's not the only one looking into this now." She gestured to her laptop screen, which showed what looked like bank statements and transaction records. "Mom, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to think really carefully about the answers." I sat down across from her, wrapping my hands around the warm mug for comfort. "Okay, in the 2 years before Dad died, did you notice any changes in his behavior? Not just the dementia symptoms, but anything else? New friends, phone calls at odd hours, packages being delivered, anything unusual?" I closed my eyes, forcing myself back to those difficult final years. Harold's decline had been gradual, then sudden, like watching a sandcastle erode wave by wave until one big surge washes the whole thing away. "He started spending a lot of time on the computer," I said slowly. He'd never been interested in technology before, but suddenly he was online for hours every day. He said he was researching investments for our retirement. Sarah made a note. "Did he mention any specific investments?" "Something about digital money. He kept talking about how traditional investments were for old people, how we needed to get with the times if we wanted to leave you anything substantial." I felt tears forming. "He wanted to provide for you, Sarah. Even when his mind was failing, that's all he cared about." "I know, Mom." Her voice softened. "What about visitors? Anyone coming to the house?" "There was a young man. Marcus, I think his name was. He started showing up maybe 18 months before your father died. Harold said he was a financial advisor, someone who specialized in helping older people maximize their investments." Sarah's pen stopped moving. "Marcus what?" I don't remember his last name. He was always very polite, well-dressed, probably in his 30s with one of those expensive haircuts. He had this way of making everything sound so simple, so obvious, like we'd be foolish not to follow his advice." "How often did he come by?" "At first, maybe once a month, then more frequently. Toward the end, he was here at least twice a week. He'd bring these fancy presentation folders, charts and graphs I didn't understand. Harold would get so excited after these meetings, talking about how Marcus was going to make us wealthy. I remembered those conversations now with horrible clarity. Harold's eyes would light up like a child's on Christmas morning when he talked about Marcus's latest investment opportunity. At the time, I'd been happy to see him enthusiastic about something. The dementia had been stealing his joy piece by piece, and Marcus seemed to bring it back. "Did you ever sit in on these meetings?" "Marcus always suggested it would be better if they talked privately. He said financial planning could be boring for people who weren't involved in the business side of things." Harold agreed. He said I didn't need to worry my pretty little head about it. The phrase tasted bitter now. How many times had I heard variations of that throughout my marriage? "Don't worry about it, Margaret. I'll handle it, Margaret." "You wouldn't understand, Margaret." Sarah was typing rapidly on her laptop. "Mom, this is important. Do you remember Marcus's car? What he looked like? Anything specific about him?" "He drove a white BMW, always parked right in front of the house like he owned the place. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair and very white teeth. Too white, you know, like those movie star veneers. And he always wore expensive-looking watches." "Did Dad ever sign papers when Marcus was here?" "Oh yes, lots of papers. Marcus would spread them out on the dining room table, and he and your father would go through them page by page. Harold would call me in to witness his signature sometimes." Sarah looked up sharply. "You witnessed Dad's signature on investment documents?" Yes, Marcus said it was just a formality, that I didn't need to read them, just sign where he pointed." The realization of what I'd done hit me like a physical blow. "Oh God, Sarah, I helped him. I helped steal our own money." "No, Mom, you were manipulated, just like Dad was. This is exactly the kind of thing these scammers do. They isolate their victims, make everything seem routine and legitimate, and use family members as unwitting accomplices." Her phone rang and she answered it immediately. "David? Yes, she's here. You found something? Okay, we'll be right there." She hung up and started gathering her papers. "David found Marcus." The name hit me like cold water. He found him. His real name is Marcus Kellerman, and he's done this before, multiple times. David wants us to meet him at the police station. Police station. This was really happening. My quiet, predictable life had become some kind of crime drama overnight. "Sarah, I'm scared." She stopped packing her briefcase and looked at me. Really looked at me. The way she used to when she was little and needed to make sure I was okay after she'd scraped her knee or had a nightmare. "I'm scared too, Mom, but we're going to get through this together." An hour later, we were sitting in Detective Linda Rodriguez's office at the Chicago PD's Financial Crimes Unit. Detective Rodriguez was probably my age, with steel gray hair and kind eyes that had clearly seen their share of heartbreak. "Mrs. Chen, I'm going to show you some photographs and I want you to tell me if you recognize anyone." She spread 5 photos across her desk. I spotted him immediately. Third from the left. That same confident smile and those 2 white teeth. "That's him, that's Marcus." "Marcus Kellerman," Detective Rodriguez confirmed. "He's been running investment scams targeting elderly couples for at least 7 years. You're the 5th family to come forward." 5th family. 5 other families had been through exactly what we were experiencing. The thought was somehow both devastating and comforting. "What happened to the other families?" I asked. Mixed results. 2 families recovered about 60% of their losses. 1 family recovered nothing. They'd waited too long to come forward, and Kellerman had already moved the money offshore. The 4th family, she paused. "They're still fighting it in court." "How long does this usually take?" Sarah asked. "Could be months, could be years. Kellerman is good at what he does. He creates complex paper trails, uses multiple shell companies, and he's very careful to make everything look legitimate on the surface." "But he can be stopped?" I asked. "We're going to try, but Mrs. Chen, I need you to understand something. Even if we catch him, even if we can prove fraud, you may not recover everything you lost. These cases are complicated, and Kellerman has had time to hide assets." The detective's honesty was both refreshing and terrifying. At least she wasn't giving us false hope. "What's our next step?" Sarah asked. "We need a complete timeline of every interaction you had with Kellerman. Every document he had your parents sign, every promise he made, every bank transaction. The more detail we have, the stronger our case becomes." As we drove home from the police station, I stared out the window at the familiar streets of my neighborhood. The same houses I'd passed thousands of times, the same trees Harold and I had watched grow from saplings to giants. Everything looked the same, but I felt like I was seeing it all through different eyes. "Sarah," I said finally, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Okay. Do you blame me? For being so naive? For trusting him completely? For not paying attention to our finances?" She was quiet for a long moment, focused on the road ahead. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but emotional. "I blame a system that taught you to be financially dependent. I blame a generation of men who thought protecting women meant keeping them ignorant. And I blame Marcus Kellerman for taking advantage of that." She glanced at me. "But I don't blame you, Mom. You trusted the person you were supposed to trust most in the world." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I could breathe again. Back at the house, Sarah and I sat at the dining room table, the same table where Harold had signed away our future, and began the painful process of reconstructing every detail of Marcus Kellerman's manipulation. "I'm going to need you to walk me through every single meeting you can remember," Sarah said, her laptop open to a fresh document. "Start with the first time he came to the house." I closed my eyes and tried to remember. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I was making pot roast for dinner, Harold's favorite Tuesday meal. The doorbell rang around 2 in the afternoon. "How did Dad introduce him?" He said Marcus had called him after seeing Dad's name on some kind of list, said he specialized in helping retirees make their money work harder. I laughed bitterly. "It worked harder, all right. Worked its way right out of our bank account." Sarah typed steadily as I talked, occasionally stopping to ask for clarification or more details. The process was exhausting but somehow cathartic. Each memory I shared felt like I was taking back a small piece of control from Marcus Kellerman. He always brought gifts, I remembered suddenly. Little things. A box of fancy chocolates, flowers for me, a bottle of wine. He said it was just his way of showing appreciation for our time. "Classic technique," Sarah muttered. "Making you feel special. Building trust through small gestures." "There was something else," I said, another memory surfacing. "He always asked about you." Sarah's fingers stopped moving on the keyboard. "What kind of questions?" "Your career, your finances, whether you were married, if you had children." He was very interested in our family dynamics. He kept saying how lucky your father was to have such a successful daughter, how proud he must be. "He was profiling our family," Sarah said grimly, "figuring out how much money we had, what our vulnerabilities were." The afternoon stretched on as we compiled our timeline. By dinner time, we had a 17-page document detailing every interaction we could remember. It felt both like progress and like reopening a wound. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," I said, as we heated up leftover Chinese takeout. Harold's sudden secrecy about money, the way he'd changed the subject when I asked about our finances, How defensive he got when I suggested we meet with our old financial advisor. Mum, you have to stop doing this to yourself. Kellerman is a professional. He's trained to spot and exploit these situations. But what if Harold wasn't the first person in our family he targeted? I asked suddenly. What if he researched us beforehand, knew about Harold's diagnosis, knew I didn't handle the finances? Sarah's chopsticks stopped halfway to her mouth. What makes you say that? Something Detective Rodriguez said today. About Kellerman being good at what he does. About him targeting elderly couples specifically. How did he know to call Harold in the first place? The question hung between us like a challenge. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed David's number. David, it's Sarah. I need you to look into something. How did Marcus Kellerman first make contact with my father? Was it really a cold call, or was there something more targeted about it? She listened for a few minutes, making notes on a napkin. Okay, yes. Can you check that tomorrow? Thanks. She hung up and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. David's going to look into whether Kellerman had access to medical records or insurance databases. If he was specifically targeting dementia patients, the implication was chilling. It meant this hadn't been random. It meant Harold had been selected, studied, hunted. I feel sick, I said, pushing away my half-eaten lo mein. We're going to make him pay for this, Mom. I promise you that. As we sat there in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of our investigation, I realized something had shifted between Sarah and me. The polite distance that had characterized our relationship since her father's death was gone, replaced by something stronger and more immediate. We weren't just mother and daughter anymore. We were allies in a fight that neither of us had asked for, but both of us were determined to win. Where are you watching this story unfold from? I'd love to know which part of the world you're joining us from as we navigate this journey together. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who hurt us deepest, but I'm learning that healing begins when we stop blaming ourselves for other people's betrayals. The battle for my family's future was just beginning, and I was starting to understand that I was stronger than I'd ever given myself credit for. 3 weeks after my world collapsed, I was standing in the courthouse bathroom at 8:47 a.m., staring at my reflection and trying to convince myself I looked like someone who could win a legal battle. The woman in the mirror had dark circles under her eyes and hands that wouldn't stop shaking, but she was wearing her best navy suit and the pearl earrings Harold had given her for their 20th anniversary. You can do this, I whispered to my reflection. You have to do this. Today was the preliminary hearing for the emergency injunction David had filed to stop the foreclosure. If we lost, I'd have 30 days to pack up 31 years of memories and find somewhere else to live on the $847 I had left in my checking account. Sarah appeared in the mirror behind me, adjusting her own reflection. She'd flown in from New York yesterday, taking time off from her job at a prestigious Manhattan law firm. The irony wasn't lost on me. My daughter had spent years building a career helping wealthy corporations solve their problems, and now she was using those same skills to save her mother from financial ruin. How are you holding up? She asked, though we both knew the answer. I keep thinking about what Detective Rodriguez said yesterday. The detective had called with an update that felt more like a punch to the stomach. They'd tracked down 2 more victims of Marcus Kellerman's scheme, but the news wasn't encouraging. Both families had been fighting for over 2 years to recover their money, and so far they'd gotten back almost nothing. Mom, today is just about stopping the foreclosure, one step at a time. But I could see the worry in her eyes. David had been honest with us about our chances. Maybe 60% that we could get a temporary stay. Much lower odds of actually recovering the money. Walking into the courtroom felt like entering a foreign country where I didn't speak the language. Everything was polished wood and serious faces, American flags and legal books that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I felt small and out of place, like a child who'd wandered into an adult conversation. Judge Patricia Hawthorne looked exactly like what Central Casting would order if they needed someone to play no-nonsense federal judge. Grey hair pulled back severely, wire-rimmed glasses, and an expression that suggested she'd heard every sob story in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. Across the aisle sat Marcus Kellerman's lawyer, a woman in an expensive suit who kept checking her Rolex and looking bored. Next to her sat a man I assumed was from the bank's legal team, shuffling through a stack of documents thick enough to choke a horse. Your Honor, David began when Judge Hawthorne called our case. We're here today because my client, Margaret Chen, has been the victim of elder financial abuse perpetrated by Marcus Kellerman, a man who systematically targeted and exploited her husband's diminishing cognitive capacity. David's voice carried the kind of authority I wished I felt. He laid out our case methodically. Harold's dementia diagnosis, Marcus's calculated manipulation, the suspicious timing of the financial transactions. Mrs. Chen trusted her husband of 41 years to manage their finances. She had no reason to suspect that his judgment was being exploited by a predator who specifically targets vulnerable elderly couples. The bank's attorney stood up when David finished. She was younger than I expected, with perfectly straightened blonde hair and the kind of confidence that comes from never having had to worry about where your next meal was coming from. Your Honor, while we certainly sympathize with Mrs. Chen's situation, the fact remains that these loans were properly executed by Harold Chen, who was of sound mind according to the medical evaluations conducted at the time. The bank followed all required procedures and had no reason to suspect fraudulent activity. Medical evaluations? What medical evaluations? I leaned over to David. What is she talking about? His expression darkened. I'll find out, the bank's attorney continued. Furthermore, Mrs. Chen herself witnessed and signed multiple documents related to these transactions. She cannot now claim ignorance of her husband's financial decisions. The words hit me like slaps across the face. Every signature Marcus had asked me to witness, every document he'd assured me was just routine paperwork, was now being used as evidence that I'd known exactly what was happening. Your Honor, David interjected, Mrs. Chen was deliberately excluded from financial discussions and was specifically told by Mr. Kellerman that she didn't need to understand the technical details. This is a classic pattern of elder abuse, isolating the victim's spouse and making them an unwitting accomplice. Judge Hawthorne had been taking notes throughout both presentations. When the lawyers finished, she removed her glasses and studied the documents in front of her. Mr. Richardson, your client's situation is certainly sympathetic, but I'm troubled by the timeline here. These transactions occurred over an 18-month period. Are you telling me that Mrs. Chen never once questioned what her husband was doing with their life savings? The question was directed at David, but it felt like an accusation aimed at me. In the judge's voice, I heard an echo of the question that had been haunting me for weeks. How could I have been so naive? Your Honor, Mrs. Chen trusted her husband completely. In their generation and socio-economic background, it was common for husbands to handle all financial matters. Mr. Kellerman deliberately exploited this dynamic. And where is Mr. Kellerman now? David's pause told me everything I needed to know before he spoke. He appears to have left the country, Your Honor. The FBI has issued a warrant, but his current location is unknown. My heart sank. Marcus was gone, probably sitting on a beach somewhere spending my retirement money on fruity drinks with little umbrellas. This complicates matters significantly, Judge Hawthorne said. Ms. Patterson, what is the bank's position on a temporary stay? The bank's attorney, Ms. Patterson, stood again. So, Your Honor, while we have sympathy for Mrs. Chen's situation, the bank cannot be held responsible for the actions of a third party. Our loans were properly executed and documented. We have our own fiduciary responsibilities to our shareholders. Fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders. I wanted to stand up and scream that I'd been banking with First National for 37 years, that Harold and I had paid our mortgage faithfully for 23 years, that their fiduciary responsibilities should include not letting con artists steal their customers' life savings, but I sat quietly like the good, polite woman I'd been raised to be. However, Ms. Patterson continued, in the interest of reaching a resolution that serves everyone's needs, the bank would be willing to discuss a modified payment plan if Mrs. Chen can demonstrate ability to make regular payments. Modified payment plan. With what money? My Social Security barely covered my utilities and groceries. Judge Hawthorne spent what felt like an eternity reviewing documents. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, Sarah's quiet breathing beside me, the scratch of the court reporter's fingers on her machine. Finally, Judge Hawthorne looked up. I'm going to grant a 60-day stay of the foreclosure proceedings to allow time for further investigation into the circumstances of these loans. However, Mrs. Chen, you need to understand that this is temporary relief. If you cannot demonstrate fraud or undue influence to my satisfaction within 60 days, the foreclosure will proceed. 60 more days. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't defeat either. It was hope, measured in weeks instead of years. As we filed out of the courtroom, Ms. Patterson approached David. My client is still interested in discussing settlement options, she said quietly. What kind of settlement? David asked. Mrs. Chen signs over the house to satisfy the debt, and the bank forgives any remaining balance. She walks away clean. They wanted me to walk away from my home, my memories, my entire adult life, and they called it walking away clean. We'll consider it, David said diplomatically, but I was already shaking my head. No. Both lawyers looked at me in surprise. I don't think either of them expected the little old lady to have opinions about her own legal case. Mrs. Chen, David started. No, I said again more firmly. I'm not giving up my house, not to them and not to Marcus Kellerman. Harold might have been tricked, but that was our home, our life. I won't just hand it over. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something besides fear and confusion. I felt angry, really, truly angry. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in weeks. Then we fight, she said simply. Walking out of the courthouse into the Chicago afternoon, I realized something had changed. I wasn't the same frightened woman who'd opened her door 3 weeks ago expecting birthday cake and received financial devastation instead. Marcus Kellerman had taken my money, but he hadn't taken my fight, and I was just getting started. If you've ever had to stand up for yourself when everything seemed stacked against you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones where we're fighting not just for our possessions, but for our dignity and sense of self-worth. The war for my future was far from over, but today I'd won the first battle, and that felt like everything. 2 weeks after the courthouse victory that didn't feel much like a victory, I was sitting in Detective Rodriguez's office again, but this time I wasn't alone. Across from me sat Eleanor Winters, 73 years old, with silver hair and eyes that burned with the same fury I'd been feeling in my chest for days. Eleanor was Marcus Kellerman's first victim, or at least the first one willing to talk about it. He took everything, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. My late husband's pension, the money we'd saved for our grandchildren's college funds, even the policy I'd planned to use for my own funeral, $723,000, gone. I did the math in my head. Between Eleanor's losses and mine, Marcus had stolen almost $1.5 million from just 2 families. How many others were there? Tell Mrs. Chen about the medical records, Detective Rodriguez said gently. Eleanor's expression darkened. Marcus knew things about my husband's condition that he shouldn't have known. Details about Robert's Alzheimer's diagnosis, his medication, even which doctor he was seeing. Information that wasn't public. My blood chilled. How is that possible? We think Marcus had inside access to medical databases, Detective Rodriguez explained, possibly through a contact at an insurance company or medical billing service. He was specifically targeting families dealing with dementia diagnoses. The full scope of Marcus's predatory behavior was becoming clear, and it was worse than I'd imagined. This wasn't just financial fraud, it was systematic exploitation of families at their most vulnerable moments. There's more, Eleanor said. I've been doing my own investigation since the police case stalled out. I found 3 other families, all with similar stories, all dealing with spouses who had cognitive decline, all approached by Marcus within months of their diagnosis. She pulled out a manila folder, thick with documents. I've been tracking his methods, his timeline, even some of his bank accounts. The police resources are limited, but use victims. We have time and motivation. I looked at this 73-year-old woman who'd turned herself into a detective, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope mixed with admiration. What have you found? Marcus uses a pattern. He researches his targets for months before making contact. He knows their financial situation, their family dynamics, their medical history. By the time he introduces himself, he already knows exactly how to manipulate them. Eleanor spread out copies of bank statements, phone records, and what looked like surveillance notes. He rented an office space in downtown Chicago using a false name. The lease was paid 6 months in advance, cash. But here's the interesting part. The building's security cameras caught him coming and going regularly, and I managed to get copies of some footage. Detective Rodriguez leaned forward. How did you get security footage? Eleanor smiled for the first time since I'd met her. My grandson works in cybersecurity. He taught me a few things about being persuasive with building managers. She pulled out a tablet and showed us grainy security footage of Marcus entering and leaving a professional building. But what caught my attention wasn't Marcus. It was the woman walking beside him in several of the clips. Who is that? That's what I've been trying to figure out, She appears in footage from 3 different time periods, always with Marcus, always carrying what looks like client files. I think she's his partner. The idea that Marcus hadn't been working alone somehow made everything worse. It meant this wasn't one man's greed. It was an organized operation targeting vulnerable families. "Detective Rodriguez," I said, "if Eleanor can find this information, why haven't the police been able to track Marcus down?" The detective's expression was diplomatic but frustrated. "Mrs. Chen, I want to be honest with you. Our resources for financial crimes are limited, especially when the perpetrator has fled the country. Cases like this can take years to resolve, and even then recovery rates are low." "What she's saying," Eleanor interjected, "is that we're on our own." The bluntness of it hit me like cold water. The system that was supposed to protect people like Harold and me had failed. The banks that had known Harold for decades had handed over our life savings to a stranger without questioning his sudden change in financial behavior. The police, despite their good intentions, didn't have the resources to chase Marcus across international borders. "So what do we do?" I asked. Eleanor's smile returned, and this time it looked almost predatory. "We do what Marcus didn't count on. We work together." Over the next hour, Eleanor laid out what she called Operation Recovery. She'd been in contact with 4 other families who'd been victimized by Marcus. Together, they'd hired a private investigator who specialized in international financial fraud. They'd pooled their resources to track Marcus's movements and identify his assets. "The thing about con artists," Eleanor explained, "is that they're creatures of habit. Marcus has a pattern, and patterns can be predicted." She showed me surveillance photos from different cities. Marcus in Miami, Marcus in Las Vegas, Marcus in what looked like an expensive resort somewhere tropical. He's not hiding, he's flaunting his success. That's going to be his downfall. How? Because people who flaunt their wealth leave digital trails. Social media posts, credit card transactions, property purchases. Our private investigator thinks he's found at least 3 properties Marcus has purchased in the last 6 months. The private investigator was named Jake Morrison, and when Eleanor called him, he agreed to meet us at a coffee shop near the police station. Jake looked like someone who'd stepped out of a detective novel. Weathered face, sharp eyes, and the kind of confidence that comes from years of tracking down people who don't want to be found. "Marcus Kellerman is currently in the Cayman Islands," Jake said without preamble. "He's been there for 6 weeks, staying at a resort that costs $3,000 a night. He's also purchased a yacht and 2 cars, all paid for in cash. My cash. My retirement fund was buying Marcus Kellerman a yacht. Can he be extradited?" I asked. "Eventually, maybe, but the Caymans have strict banking privacy laws, and Marcus has been careful to structure his transactions through shell companies. It could take years. So he gets away with it?" Jake's expression was grim but determined. "Not necessarily. Marcus made one crucial mistake. He kept using the same methods, the same contacts, the same financial structures. We've been able to trace approximately $2.3 million in assets that can be definitively linked to his fraud scheme. $2.3 million. The number was staggering. How many families had Marcus destroyed? "Here's what I'm proposing," Jake continued. "We file a civil asset forfeiture claim against Marcus's domestic properties and accounts. It's faster than criminal prosecution, and we don't need to wait for him to be extradited. If we can prove the assets were purchased with stolen money, we can seize them." "How long would that take?" Eleanor asked. 4 to 6 months if everything goes smoothly. But here's the thing. We'd need all the victims to work together. The more families that join the civil action, the stronger our case becomes. I thought about Judge Hawthorne's 60-day deadline for the foreclosure stay. "I don't have 4 to 6 months." "Actually, you might," Jake said. "If we can file the civil action within the next 2 weeks, it gives us grounds to request an extension of your foreclosure stay. Courts are generally sympathetic to victims who are actively pursuing recovery of stolen assets." For the first time in weeks, I felt like we had a real plan. Not just hope, but actual concrete steps that might lead to getting my life back. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Everything. Every document Marcus had you sign. Every conversation you remember. Every bank statement from the period when he was targeting your family. And I need you to talk to other potential victims." "How do I find other victims?" Eleanor answered. "Support groups for families dealing with dementia, senior centers, church groups. Marcus targeted people in our community, which means there are probably others who haven't come forward yet." The idea of approaching other families, asking them to relive their own financial nightmares, felt overwhelming. But looking at Eleanor, seeing how she'd channeled her pain into action, I realized I had a choice. I could be a victim or I could be a fighter. "I'll do it," I said. Jake nodded approvingly. Mrs. Chen, I want you to understand something. This isn't going to be easy and there are no guarantees. Marcus is smart, he's well funded, and he's had time to cover his tracks. But he made one crucial error. What's that? He underestimated the determination of the people he stole from. Walking out of that coffee shop, I felt different than I had since this nightmare began. I wasn't just waiting for someone else to solve my problems anymore. I was part of the solution. Sarah was waiting for me at home, surrounded by legal documents and laptop computers. When I told her about Eleanor and Jake and Operation Recovery, her eyes lit up with the same fire I was starting to feel. Mom, this is it. This is how we get him. Sarah, I need to ask you something. Are you prepared for this to take months, maybe longer? I know you have your own life in New York. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, fierce, protective, and absolutely certain. Mom, I took a leave of absence from my job. I'm not going anywhere until we get every penny back and put Marcus Kellerman in prison where he belongs. My daughter had put her career on hold to fight for our family's future. The realization hit me with a wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm me. Thank you, I whispered. Thank me when we win, she said simply. If you've ever had to make the choice between being a victim or being a fighter, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Sometimes the most important moment in any battle is when you realize you're not fighting alone, and that the people who tried to break you might have just made you stronger than you ever knew you could be. Marcus Kellerman thought he'd destroyed a helpless old woman. He was about to discover he'd awakened something much more dangerous, a mother with nothing left to lose, and a daughter who'd inherited her fighting spirit. The community center in Oak Park smelled like coffee and disinfectant, with fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly gray. I'd been coming to the Alzheimer's support group for exactly 6 days, not because I needed support for Harold's death. Grief counseling had helped me through that 2 years ago, but because I was hunting for other families Marcus Kellerman had destroyed. Margaret, would you like to share how you're doing this week? Asked Dr. Patricia Mills, the group facilitator who wore cardigans in every color of the rainbow and had the kind of gentle voice that made people want to confess their deepest fears. I looked around the circle of faces, 12 other people who understood the special kind of hell that comes with watching someone you love disappear piece by piece. Most of them were women my age, though there was one man, probably in his 50s, who always sat in the corner and barely spoke. Actually, I said, my heart pounding, I wanted to ask the group about something. Has anyone here ever been approached by financial advisors after your loved one's diagnosis? Specifically, someone offering investment opportunities that seemed too good to be true. The silence that followed was deafening, but I saw something flicker across 3 faces. Recognition followed immediately by shame. Why do you ask? This came from Linda, a woman about my age who'd been caring for her husband's Parkinson's dementia for 5 years. I took a deep breath. Because my husband was targeted by a financial predator who stole our entire life savings. And I think he specifically targets families in situations like ours. The floodgates opened. Oh my God, whispered Janet, a soft-spoken woman who usually only spoke when directly asked. There was a man who came to our house, Thomas something. He said he could help us pay for my mother's care. Marcus, said Linda, her voice barely audible. His name was Marcus. He took $60,000 from us. 78,000, said Robert, the quiet man in the corner. He said he could triple our money in 6 months. My wife believed him. I was too exhausted from caregiving to pay attention. One by one, the stories poured out. Marcus had found them all during their most vulnerable moments, when they were overwhelmed by medical bills and care costs, when their cognitive resources were depleted from the constant stress of caring for someone with dementia. By the end of the meeting, I had contacted information for 5 more families. 5 more families who'd been ashamed to admit they'd been scammed, who'd been suffering in silence while Marcus Kellerman lived on a yacht, purchased with their retirement funds. Margaret, Dr. Mills said as we were packing up, I think what you're doing is incredibly brave. These families have been carrying this shame for months, some of them for years. You've given them permission to speak up. That evening, Sarah and I sat at the kitchen table with a map of Chicago spread out in front of us, marking locations where Marcus had struck. The pattern was becoming clear. He'd targeted a specific demographic in specific neighborhoods, upper middle-class families in established communities, where people trusted easily and didn't expect to be preyed upon. Mum, this is huge, Sarah said, updating our victim spreadsheet. We now have documented losses of over $3 million from just 8 families. Jake's going to be ecstatic. Jake Morrison had been true to his word. In the 2 weeks since our coffee shop meeting, he'd filed preliminary asset forfeiture claims, against 3 of Marcus's domestic properties and frozen 2 bank accounts. The legal machinery was finally moving in our direction, but the personal cost was becoming clear too. Every family I talked to was dealing with the same devastating combination of financial ruin and emotional trauma. The Hendersons had lost their home. The Kowalskis were living on food stamps. The Patels had been forced to move their father to a lower-quality memory care facility because they could no longer afford the good one. Sarah, sometimes I wonder if we're doing the right thing. These people have been through enough. Asking them to relive their trauma by joining our legal case. Mom, you're not asking them to relive their trauma. You're giving them a chance to fight back. There's a difference. She was right, but it still felt overwhelming. I'd gone from being a victim to being responsible for other victims, and the weight of that responsibility kept me awake at night. My phone rang, interrupting my brooding. It was Eleanor. Margaret, you need to get down to Jake's office immediately. He's found something big. Jake's office was in a converted warehouse in the trendy part of downtown, all exposed brick and industrial fixtures. When Sarah and I arrived, we found Eleanor, Jake, and 2 people I didn't recognize hunched around a conference table covered with documents. Margaret, Sarah, meet FBI agent Lisa Pettigrew and Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chang, Jake said by way of introduction. FBI. My knees nearly gave out. Agent Pettigrew was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with short dark hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen every type of criminal behavior imaginable. She stood to shake my hand. Mrs. Chen, thank you for coming. Your civil investigation has uncovered evidence that's crucial to a federal case we've been building. Federal case? Marcus Kellerman isn't just a local con artist, Attorney Chang explained. He's part of an international fraud network that's been operating in 12 states and 3 countries. Your private investigation has provided the missing links we needed. Jake pulled out a thick folder. Remember that woman we saw in the security footage, the one who appeared to be Marcus's partner? I nodded. Her name is Victoria Lang. She's a licensed practical nurse who was stealing patient information from 3 different medical facilities in the Chicago area. She was providing Marcus with the names and medical details of families dealing with cognitive decline. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. It wasn't just Marcus who'd targeted vulnerable families. It was a nurse who'd taken an oath to help people, systematically violating patient privacy to enable financial predators. Victoria Lang was arrested yesterday in Miami, Agent Pettigrew continued. She's cooperating with our investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. She's provided us with the names and details of 67 families that Marcus targeted over the past 3 years. 67 families. The number hit me like a physical blow. How much money total? Sarah asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Approximately $12.4 million, Attorney Chang said quietly. $12 million. $12 million stolen from families dealing with the most difficult circumstances imaginable. I felt sick. But here's the good news, Jake said quickly. With Victoria's cooperation and the evidence your civil case has generated, we've been able to trace and freeze over $8 million in assets. Real estate, bank accounts, investments, even the yacht. Does this mean the families can get their money back? It means we have a real chance, Agent Pettigrew said. The federal case takes precedence over your civil case, but it also has more resources and more power. We can claw back assets through criminal forfeiture that would be impossible to reach through civil proceedings. What happens now? Now we build the strongest possible case against Marcus Kellerman and everyone who helped him. That means we need detailed statements from every victim, documentation of every transaction, and testimony about how this fraud has impacted your lives. Attorney Chang leaned forward. Mrs. Chen, I want to be completely honest with you. This is going to be difficult. You'll need to testify potentially multiple times. Defense attorneys will question your judgment, your memory, your husband's mental state. They'll try to make it seem like you were willing participants rather than victims. The thought of sitting in a courtroom while lawyers attacked my character and questioned Harold's memory was terrifying. But then I thought about Janet from the support group, who'd been too ashamed to tell her own children she'd been scammed. I thought about Robert, caring for his wife while dealing with the financial devastation Marcus had caused. I thought about all 67 families who'd been targeted because someone they trusted, a medical professional, had sold their private information to a predator. I'll do it, I said. Whatever it takes. Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand. We'll do it together. Agent Pettigrew smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from her. Mrs. Chen, I want you to know that your decision to fight back, to investigate on your own, to reach out to other victims. It's what made this case possible. Marcus Kellerman counted on his victims being too ashamed or too isolated to fight back. He didn't count on you. Walking out of Jake's office that evening, I realized that somewhere in the past month, I'd become someone I barely recognized. The timid woman who'd let Harold handle all the finances, who'd signed documents without reading them, who'd trusted everyone and questioned nothing, that woman was gone. In her place was someone who could walk into a room full of strangers and ask difficult questions. Someone who could face down FBI agents and federal prosecutors. Someone who could stand up for not just herself, but for 66 other families who'd been betrayed the same way. Marcus Kellerman had tried to destroy me. Instead, he'd created his own worst nightmare, a victim who refused to stay silent. "Mom," Sarah said as we drove home through the Chicago traffic, "I'm proud of you. Dad would be proud of you too." For the first time since Harold's death, I believe that was true. If you've ever discovered that fighting for what's right sometimes means becoming a person you never knew you could be, tell me in the comments which part of the world you're joining us from. Sometimes our greatest strength comes from our greatest pain, and sometimes the people who try to break us end up revealing just how unbreakable we really are. The final battle was still ahead of us, but tonight I felt ready for war. 6 months after my worst birthday ever, I was standing in federal court wearing the same navy suit I'd worn to that first devastating hearing, but everything else had changed. The woman in the mirror that morning had looked confident, determined, and ready for battle. She looked like someone who could win. Marcus Kellerman sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his expensive haircut grown out and his perfect teeth hidden behind a scowl. The FBI had finally tracked him down in the Cayman Islands 3 weeks ago, and extradition had been swift once the State Department got involved. Apparently, stealing $12 million from elderly Americans had made him a priority. The federal courthouse was packed. 37 of the 67 families Marcus had victimized were there, along with their lawyers, FBI agents, journalists, and court officials. It felt like the entire city of Chicago had come to watch justice being served. "Mrs. Chen," Attorney Chang had prepared me the night before, "you'll be the first victim to testify. Your case started this investigation, and your testimony will set the tone for everything that follows. Are you ready?" I was ready. More ready than I'd ever been for anything in my life. Judge Harrison called the court to order, and I watched Marcus's lawyer, an expensive-looking man who probably cost more per hour than I spent on groceries in a month, lean over to whisper something in his client's ear. Marcus didn't look at the gallery where his victims sat. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, as if he could will us all to disappear. The prosecution calls Margaret Chen to the witness stand. Walking to that witness stand felt like the longest journey of my life, but also the most important. I'd been practicing my testimony for weeks, going over every detail with Sarah, with Attorney Chang, with the victim advocate the FBI had assigned to our case. "Mrs. Chen," Attorney Chang began after I'd been sworn in, "please tell the court about your marriage to Harold Chen." I spoke about our 41 years together, about the life we'd built, the dreams we'd shared, the retirement we'd planned. I told them about Harold's dementia diagnosis and how it had changed our world, but not our love for each other. "And how did you first encounter the defendant, Marcus Kellerman?" I looked directly at Marcus as I answered. He still wouldn't meet my eyes. "He came to our door on a Tuesday afternoon in October 2022. He said he specialized in helping elderly couples maximize their retirement investments. He seemed so knowledgeable, so trustworthy. He made us feel special, like we'd been chosen for an exclusive opportunity." Attorney Chang led me through the entire timeline. Every meeting, every document, every promise Marcus had made. I testified about how he'd deliberately excluded me from financial discussions, how he'd used Harold's declining judgment against him, how he'd turned our trust into a weapon. "Mrs. Chen, at any point did you suspect that Mr. Kellerman might be defrauding your family?" "No, never. I trusted my husband completely, and my husband trusted Marcus. We believed we were securing our future. Instead, we were signing it away." Marcus's lawyer stood for cross-examination. He was everything I'd expected, polished, aggressive, and completely without sympathy. "Mrs. Chen, isn't it true that you signed multiple documents related to these financial transactions?" "Yes, and isn't it true that you could have read those documents before signing them?" "Marcus told me I didn't need to read them, that they were just routine paperwork." "But you chose not to read them, correct? You chose to sign legal documents without understanding what they said." The question was designed to make me feel stupid, to make the jury think I'd been careless rather than manipulated, but I was ready for it. Sir, I'd been married for 41 years to a man I trusted completely. Marcus Kellerman deliberately exploited that trust and my husband's declining mental capacity. He counted on families like mine being too ashamed to fight back when we discovered what he'd done. He was wrong. The courtroom was silent. Even Marcus's lawyer seemed taken aback by the strength in my voice. "No further questions," he said quietly. "I spent 3 hours on that witness stand, and when I finally stepped down, I felt like I'd fought the most important battle of my life and won." The trial lasted 2 weeks. Eleanor testified about her own losses and the investigation she'd conducted. Robert from the support group broke down crying as he described having to tell his children they couldn't afford college because Marcus had stolen their education funds. Victoria Lang, the nurse who'd provided Marcus with patient information, testified about how the scheme worked from the inside. But the most powerful testimony came from Harold. Sarah had found something during her methodical review of our financial records. A voice memo Harold had recorded on his phone 3 months before he died. He'd been trying to remember the details of his meetings with Marcus, and in his confused state, he'd recorded his thoughts. "I can't remember what I signed today," Harold's voice said through the courtroom speakers, thin and confused, but unmistakably him. "Margaret keeps asking about the money, but Marcus says not to worry her. I think maybe I made a mistake. But Marcus says it's too late to change anything now. I just want to take care of my girls. I just want to leave them something." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even the judge had to pause to compose herself. Marcus's defense was pathetic. His lawyer argued that Marcus had genuinely believed the cryptocurrency investments were legitimate, that he'd been duped by international criminals just like his clients had been. But the evidence was overwhelming. The systematic targeting of dementia patients, the deliberate exclusion of spouses from financial discussions, the complex shell companies designed to hide stolen money. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. On the charge of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of elder abuse, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. Guilty on all 15 counts, Marcus Kellerman was going to prison for a very long time. But the real victory came 3 hours later, in Attorney Chang's office. "Mrs. Chen, I'm pleased to inform you that the asset forfeiture has been approved. Including interest and penalties, your family will recover approximately 93% of your stolen funds." 93%. Not everything, but enough to save my house, enough to restore my retirement security, enough to give me back the future Harold had wanted to provide. What about the other families? Recovery percentages vary based on when they were victimized and how much Marcus had already moved offshore, but every family will receive substantial restitution. The Hendersons will get their house back. The Kowalskis will be able to afford proper care for their father. Because you fought back, Mrs. Chen, 66 other families are getting their lives back too. That evening, Sarah and I sat in our kitchen, because it was going to stay our kitchen, sharing a bottle of wine and a store-bought birthday cake. It was exactly 7 months after the birthday that had started this nightmare. "To second chances," Sarah said, raising her glass. "To learning that we're stronger than we knew," I replied. "To Dad, who would be proud of both of us. To the future we almost lost but fought to keep." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, surrounded by the legal documents that had become such a huge part of our lives, but also surrounded by family photos and memories that no one could ever steal. "Mum, what are you going to do now that this is all over?" I thought about it. The woman who'd answered her door 7 months ago, expecting a quiet birthday celebration, could never have imagined the journey that followed. She could never have imagined testifying in federal court, leading an investigation that brought down an international fraud ring, or becoming an advocate for elder abuse victims. "I think I'm going to volunteer with the FBI's Victim Services Division," I said finally. "Help other families who are going through what we went through." Sarah smiled. "Of course you are. And I'm going to learn how to manage my own finances. No more letting other people handle my money, no matter how much I trust them. I can teach you about investments if you want. I'd like that." 3 months later, I received a letter from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Marcus Kellerman had been sentenced to 27 years in federal prison. He would be 91 years old before he was eligible for parole. Justice, it turned out, was better than any birthday gift I could have imagined, but the real gift had been discovering who I was when everything I thought I knew about myself was stripped away. The real gift had been learning that love and determination could overcome betrayal and loss. The real gift had been finding out that my daughter and I could face anything together. Marcus Kellerman had stolen my money, but he'd given me something too. He'd given me back my strength. On my 70th birthday, exactly 1 year after this story began, Sarah brought me a gift that meant more than any material possession ever could. A framed photo of us standing on the courthouse steps after Marcus's sentencing, our arms around each other, both of us smiling like we'd just conquered the world, because in a way we had. If this story has touched your heart or inspired you to stand up for yourself or someone you love, please let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the foundation for the strongest, most authentic versions of ourselves. Sometimes what breaks us is exactly what we needed to become, who we were always meant to be. The fight for my family's future was over. The fight for other families' futures was just beginning, and I had never felt more ready for battle.